The rather dramatic, maybe over-dramatic title for this talk involves a little malice of forethought. Those of you who were around last year may remember that I gave a talk called Freedom, Sovereignty, and Other Endangered Species. And I rather suspected that Jane might have a masochistic streak and asked me to come back and finish it up. So I left something out, one endangered species, namely the most important one, that is us. Now, that's what I want to talk about now. There's been a lot of doomsday prophesying in the past 30 years or so, ever since Club of Rome and other publications. Actually, I have something a little different in mind. I want to consider the self-destructive tendencies in the institutions that humans have constructed and that now dominate international society. And by institution, I mean the term institutions pretty broadly, including cultural institutions, cultural practices, systems of beliefs and attitudes, and so on. That these institutions in this broad sense have, so in other words, not just socioeconomic and political institutions, though those as well, that these institutions have self-destructive tendencies is perhaps too obvious to waste much attention on. The question is how powerful are they? To what extent are they out of control? Well, any rational person hopes that we won't find out the answer to that question for obvious reasons. And any rational person also knows that whatever the answer is, it will depend a lot upon us here, meaning the United States, people like us within the United States. The reason is simply very simple. It just has to do with just a consequence of the concentration of power and privilege, which is extraordinary, and we're mostly right in the center of us. Well, these ought to be truisms. So let me just, before I go on, add a few others. It's a moral truism that power and responsibility confer, power and privilege confer responsibility. That should be obvious. It's an empirical truism that a meaningful effort to live up to that responsibility requires a willingness to look at ourselves without comforting illusions. And it's a historical truism that responsibility is very easy to evade. In fact, one might claim without too much exaggeration that evasion of it is a leading theme of intellectual history. Well, these truisms, I think, are useful to keep in mind as we, if at least we are interested in asking some questions about our place in the world, what it is and what it ought to be. Let me give a couple of current illustrations just to illustrate what I mean. So I'll start with today's newspapers. The New York Times regards itself as the greatest newspaper in the world, correctly, I think. One of the great things about the New York Times is that you can count on it to provide a theme, a good illustration for the opening theme of any political talk, especially any one that's critical of the New York Times and what it stands for. And it didn't fail me this time. I waited and came along just in time. So take the Sunday edition of the New York Times, last Sunday. The Week in Review, where you find the deep commentaries, has a major think piece, as usual, on the front page. This one is called How to Face the Past. It's concerned with the crimes of the past century and how they're being faced in the societies that are responsible for them. And it illustrates very well the truisms that I think we should bear in mind. First of all, for one reason, because it's mistitled. The title should have been How Others Should Face the Past and the Crimes of the Past. Notably missing from this long discussion is the topic that would be central to anyone who's serious about the topic and about themselves, namely, what about our crimes? How do we face up to them? Nothing about that. Well, maybe the reason is that there aren't any crimes, so we don't have to face anything. Actually, that is pretty clearly the tacit assumption. And the author has to keep to a rather delicate path to sustain it. So, for example, he mentions that Chile has been, quoting from it, has been slow to face the crimes of the military regime that replaced the overthrew the democratic government 30 years ago. Well, another country comes to mind that had some share in that, and maybe they have some questions to face. If so, it's not suggested. Actually, this is a highly misleading example. The reason is that whatever the U.S. crimes may have been in Chile, they're kind of marginal. The major U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere, in fact in the world in the past century, has been much more direct than Chile and much closer to home, not surprisingly, namely in the Caribbean and Central America. I just happened to have returned from there, so it's in the front of my mind. I went to two countries, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, well chosen to illustrate this topic. Nicaragua and Costa Rica are at opposite ends of the spectrum in the region in terms of quality of life and prospects for the future, including prospects for survival. Costa Rica is the regional exception. It's, by regional standards, fairly well-to-do, more or less of a social democracy. It even approaches the health standards of Cuba. Nicaragua, on the other hand, is right now vying with Guatemala for the position of the second poorest country in the hemisphere. It has achieved that status since the U.S. took it over again 10 years ago, declining rapidly since. The poorest is Haiti, as I'm sure you know. The U.S. took it over 10 years ago after a murderous terrorist war that devastated the country, killed tens of thousands of people, set in motion what's been happening since. The U.S. was condemned by the World Court, ordered to terminate what the court called the unlawful use of force. U.S. responded by rapidly escalating the force. There was a Democrat-controlled Congress that did that. The court was dismissed as with ridicule and contempt. The court ordered the United States to pay heavy reparations, usually estimated around $17 billion. Of course, that disappeared very quickly. The condition on allowing Nicaragua to enter the world system after the U.S. victory was that it drop any such claims. And in fact, the way it ends up is Nicaragua is paying reparations to the United States. That's pretty typical. Well, Costa Rica is different. It's the only country in Central America which escaped the terror of the 1980s. Every other country was under either direct or indirect attack by the United States. It was no joke either. It left a couple 100,000 corpses, hundreds of thousands, millions, in fact, of refugees and orphans. 3 countries totally ruined, 4th pretty much ruined. As I say, Costa Rica was the exception. In fact, Costa Rica is the only country in the hemisphere, in the region, that has never been attacked directly by the United States. The reasons for that are interesting, worth pursuing. Actually, the answers are revealing, but I'll put it aside and just mention the fact. It's a fact. Costa Rica is the regional exception in this respect as well. It's never been the target of direct U.S. aggression and terror. Haiti, on at the opposite extreme, the poorest country in the hemisphere, happens to have the record for the most severe and intense U.S. intervention, military intervention, and other kind of repression during the past century. That's ever since Woodrow Wilson conquered it in 1915. One of the exercises that's known to those of you who study these things as Wilsonian idealism. The Wilson invasion killed thousands of people, restored virtual slavery. The Marines were sent in to dismiss the Parliament because it was refusing to accept a U.S. written constitution for which FDR took credit, rightly or wrongly. The legislative requirement that the U.S. insisted on was that the Constitution of Haiti be revised to allow U.S. corporations to buy up Haitian land, which they agreed to at the point of a gun. Actually, there was a vote which came out something like 99.9% in favor of the 5% of the population who participated. It's called democracy. The Marines left 20 years later, leaving the country a U.S. plantation under the rule of a vicious National Guard, armed and trained by the United States, and it's stayed pretty much that way ever since. So that's the record for the century in U.S. intervention. Nicaragua and Guatemala hold second place for U.S. military intervention in the past century. In fact, in Nicaragua's case, goes back to 1854, when the U.S. Navy burned down a town, port town, in retaliation, revenge for an alleged insult to the millionaire Cornelius Vanderbilt, who felt his yacht wasn't treated properly when it landed there. Well, without going on, there's a pretty well-established generalization. The greater the U.S. military involvement and control, the greater the poverty and misery. It's a pretty close correlation. Few things in history work out this clearly. And the poverty and misery is quite severe. Haiti and Nicaragua may be literally uninhabitable in another generation or two. El Salvador, which is another leading target of U.S. terror, especially in the 80s, that's not very far behind. Well, these things, they take a considerable effort to ignore, I think, and particularly because they generalize. So in Asia, there's one country that's a basket case, stayed out of the, wasn't part of the Asian economic miracle of the last 20 or 30 years, namely the Philippines, which was conquered by the United States 100 years ago, killing several 100,000 people, stayed a U.S. colony for half a century and a neo-colony ever since. Again, continues to the present. There are other correlations that are, again, kind of tricky to ignore. It takes a little effort, I suppose. One of them is that there's a very well-established correlation, which you can read in the mainstream scholarly literature, in fact, between U.S. aid, including U.S. military aid, and torture and state terror. They correlate very closely. Actually, these studies were done in 1980. Nobody bothered to do them during the 1980s because the results were too obvious. You don't do experiments to show that 2 + 2 = 4. It continues through the 90s, very dramatically, in fact. The leading human rights violator in the hemisphere through the 90s by a considerable margin is Colombia. It's also been the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and training right through the 1990s. In fact, about half of the military aid and training in the hemisphere. So the correlation continues. In 1999, Colombia actually took first place in the world as the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and training. Notice I'm omitting here Israel and Egypt, which are in a separate category. But outside of them, Colombia took first place. It replaced Turkey, which had previously been the leader for some years, except for a brief period when El Salvador took first place during the period of the most intense state terrorist attack, basically U.S. attack against the population. But Turkey had for a while been the leading recipient of U.S. military aid, replaced by Colombia in 1999. Well, why Turkey? Turkey is a strategic ally. It's next to Russia, next to the Middle East. So it had always gotten substantial military aid. It was kind of level into the early 80s. In 1984, the military aid shot up. Notice that had absolutely nothing to do with the Cold War, transparently. What it had to do with is the fact that in 1984, Turkey launched a counterinsurgency campaign against its miserably oppressed Kurdish population. And that required military aid, and the United States was happy to provide it in the interest of human rights and freedom and justice. And the aid stayed very high. As I say, Turkey was first place, though replaced for a while by El Salvador, stayed very high until 1999. The main atrocities were in the Clinton years, and that's when the aid went up as well. As the atrocities escalated, so did the military aid. Clinton administration was providing 80% of Turkey's arms. The peak year was 1997. In fact, in the single year 1997, the United States provided more military aid to Turkey than in the entire period, 1950 to 1983. The entire Cold War period was outweighed in the single year of 1997. And the results were impressive. 2 to 3 million refugees, 3,500 or so villages and towns wiped out, tens of thousands of people killed. Actually, nobody really knows the details. Since it's our crimes, nobody investigates, and it's rarely reported, very rarely, in fact, usually denied. The fact, however, is that this is one of the most extreme examples of atrocities and ethnic cleansing in the 1990s, right through to the late 1990s. Recall that this is within NATO. It's not across its borders where we're supposed to be very upset about crimes. By 1999, the Clinton-backed atrocities and ethnic cleansing had succeeded. The Kurdish insurgency had been crushed. The Colombian insurgency, however, had not yet been crushed. Correspondingly, and if you're rational, perhaps, therefore, Colombia replaced Turkey as the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and training. Well, these again are things you're just not supposed to notice because they conform too well to the moral truism. They tell you too much about our institutions and how they function, and about the intellectual culture that protects and supports them, our culture, which we take part in, contribute to, and sustain. It's not something out there somewhere. The same issue of the New York Times on Sunday also has a book review by a well-known liberal historian about several new books about Vietnam. That's appropriate. We're now approaching the 40th anniversary of the U.S. attack against South Vietnam. Remember that South Vietnam was always the major target of the U.S. attack. Of course, the U.S. said it was there to defend the government of South Vietnam from terrorists from abroad, essentially what the Russians said about their invasion of Afghanistan, and with maybe about half as much legitimacy. But we're supposed to believe it, so therefore that's the line. Anyhow, we're coming up to 40 years. It's 1961 and 62 is when Kennedy launched the direct attack against South Vietnam. That's after about 6 years of the U.S. running a Latin American-style terror state there, in which about 60,000 to 70,000 people were killed. eliciting resistance which couldn't be controlled, so the U.S. invaded directly. The results I don't have to go through. You should know them. It's maybe worth mentioning that in a poll a couple of years, I think it's the only poll I know of, where Americans were asked to estimate the number of Vietnamese dead in the war. The average guess was about 100,000. If there was a poll in Germany which revealed that Germans estimated the number of Holocaust victims at 200,000, we might think there's a little bit of a problem in German culture that should perhaps be looked at. But since this is our massacres and atrocities, the question doesn't arise. And it doesn't arise in the review or in the books. The review and the books never suggest that there's anything wrong about anything we did. The only problem is, was it a failure? Why was it a failure? You know, who's responsible, and so on. The kind of questions that the German General Staff would have been raising after Stalingrad, I suppose. That's pretty typical. Just to mention another current case, there was a couple of weeks ago a meeting in Havana, which you probably read about in the paper. It was a meeting of Kennedy advisors and Bay of Pigs veterans meeting with Cubans to go over what happened at the Bay of Pigs invasion. The reports were quite interesting. They also never hinted that there might be something wrong with invading another country. It was always a question of why it failed and that sort of thing. A friend of mine is a veteran Latin American correspondent who actually reported the invasion from Cuba back then. He attended, and I asked him, he told me that at the discussions that question was never raised, just not an issue. You don't raise that kind of question. Recently, the State Department released about 1,000 pages of documents on the missile crisis, 1962. A good part of the documents deal with the terror operations that Kennedy organized. Kennedy was a super hawk and deeply committed to massive terror. Cuba was one of the victims. Colombia was another, incidentally. And a lot of this deals with the terror. It wasn't jokes either. It was serious stuff, killings, blowing up installations, blowing up hotels, all sorts of things. There was a review of all of this in Diplomatic History, which is the main serious professional journal. Several reviews, several scholars wrote reviews of the 1,000 pages. One of them, Jorge Dominguez at Harvard, pointed out in his review, he went through the material, but he pointed out an interesting fact, the fact that he felt that was interesting, namely in 1,000 pages of documents on Operation Mongoose and other terrorist operations, he was only able to find one phrase in 1,000 pages that suggested, of these internal discussions and planning and stuff, one phrase that suggested that there may be some problem with this. It was a staffer for the National Security Council who wanted to raise the possibility that if any of these atrocities became public, it might harm the U.S. image in Europe, and therefore they didn't care much about Latin America, but might harm it in Europe, and therefore maybe we should have some second thoughts, or at least keep them more quiet. Remember who these people were. These were the intellectual elite from Harvard, MIT, and places like that. And it's an interesting reflection on the moral and cultural institutions. That's just from current things. It's very easy to find more if you go back. Well, let's go back to the New York Times review, the think piece on how others should face crimes. It opens with the trial of Milosevic right now. And in fact, that's the main theme. The main theme is Serb crimes. The writer points out correctly that the war crimes trial, the International War Crimes Trial, is only for Milosevic's crimes in Kosovo. He didn't ask why that limit was imposed. It's an interesting question, but let's put it aside. Actually, it's not quite accurate either. It's not for Milosevic's crimes in Kosovo, it's for his crimes after March 24th, 1999. If you read the indictment, you find that virtually every crime mentioned is that's the day when the U.S. NATO bombing began. Virtually everything mentioned is some crime that took place after the bombing. There are reasons for that time frame as well, carefully evaded in the huge literature that's come out about this topic. Come back to it if you like, but I'll skip it now. Anyway, it's a fact. Virtually nothing in the indictment, few things, but very little before the bombing. So the war crimes trials are in fact for crimes within a very specific time frame, namely the crime, and they're real crimes, no doubt about that, the crimes committed under NATO bombing. The crimes that were incidentally anticipated and not very surprising, doesn't change the fact that they're crimes. Well, without proceeding with that, I'll mention that there's another trial going on right now. It's not in Belgrade or in The Hague, but in Washington. This is the trial of General Johnny Lumintang. He's an Indonesian general who was implicated in planning and executing massive crimes in East Timor in 1999, far beyond anything attributed to Milosevic, I should say. Furthermore, not only are these much worse in character, they also happen to be war crimes, not just crimes against humanity, that is, crimes in the course of aggression, the most serious kind. Furthermore, these crimes were not carried out under bombing by a superpower. In fact, not even under any fighting. There was nothing going on, just plain massive attacks on the civilian population. There was a superpower involved, actually two, the United States and Britain. They had been involved for a long time, 25 years in fact. They were involved in arming and training the killers. That continued right through 1999. In earlier years, their involvement actually was genocidal, one of the places where that overused word really applies. Relative to the population, the deaths, killings were probably greater than anything since the Holocaust. And that continued through 1999. The U.S.-British client destroyed about 70% of the country, drove out 85% of the population, killed nobody knows how many people, and nobody ever will know for a very good reason. The United States prevented the dispatch of any forensic experts, quite different from Kosovo, where the place was flooded by forensic experts to try to dig out crimes of the official enemy, but here they were withheld despite pleas from the UN and Australia. Furthermore, the U.S. has blocked any tribunal, so there'll never be an investigation. But there is a trial going on, Lumintang's trial. Lumintang was served court papers in Washington on March 27th. He was in Washington at the invitation of the State Department. He's one of their favorites. The State Department was pretty upset by the fact that he was handed a subpoena, and the U.S. apologized profusely to the government of Indonesia for this indignity. He was quickly spirited out of the country, but the trial is proceeding in absentia and in silence. There hasn't been a word about it. Good reasons. Unlike Milosevic under NATO bombing, Lumintang is a U.S.-run criminal responsible for much worse crimes. So therefore, his trial right in Washington, not very easy to ignore, has to be ignored by the usual principles. Well, of course, it could be argued that Lumintang is not the top commander, which is correct. He's greatly implicated. He was not the top commander. The top commander was General Wiranto. He was granted an amnesty in advance, just in case there ever might be a tribunal, not that there's much threat of that. The top leaders are, of course, exempt. And the decisive role of the United States and Britain, that's also exempt. And it is decisive, right back through the Ford and particularly Carter years. In fact, the role of the United States is virtually entirely suppressed in the United States, with has been all along, still is. In Britain, not so completely. Britain is not is a less disciplined society than us, not just in this respect. Even worse than that, the current story that's now around, and that will enter history, of course, is that the U.S. led the humanitarian intervention in East Timor because it was so appalled by the crimes, which in fact it was carrying out. This was after it had unfortunately overlooked the crimes of the past 25 years over which it was presiding and for which it provided the crucial military and diplomatic support, with about a third of the population wiped out, all thanks to the complicity of the media and the intellectual culture generally, folks like us, people who are always very agitated about the other guy's crimes. Well, these are near historical universals. It's all too easy to continue with this shameful story. Just keeping to the Sunday New York Times, which incidentally I haven't exhausted, I've just sampled. I could go on for another hour on that, but I won't. And I should say that the U.S. and Britain are by no means unusual, and as I said before, this is pretty standard. The main difference between the United States and Britain and other societies is that the United States and Britain have never been defeated. And furthermore, they have been dominant societies. And for those reasons alone, they have nothing to regret. It follows that if you're not defeated and you're in a dominant position, you didn't do anything wrong. That's kind of like a principle of logic. Therefore, you have nothing to regret. And in fact, you can bask in self-adulation for your courageous leadership in the cause of human rights and freedom and so on. And it's essentially the task of the intellectual community to make sure that this all works very smoothly. And it does. There's rarely a hitch. Well, I should say, and for accuracy, that there sometimes is a hitch. So the charge is not totally accurate. Our country, the United States, as you know, was founded and developed, in fact, on the basis of terrible crimes, slavery and the most extreme ethnic cleansing in history, I suppose. And there have been occasional statements of regret, never any official statements. One of the rare examples, and they are very rare in high places, is John Quincy Adams. He was a major contributor to massive crimes. And long after his involvement in that, long after he was out of office, Adams deplored, I'm quoting, "the heinous sins for which I believe God will one day bring this nation to judgment." He hoped that this belated stand would somehow aid that hapless race of Native Americans that we are exterminating with such merciless and perfidious cruelty. He hoped in vain, of course. The attack escalated very quickly. And continued until the dispossession and the extermination were almost complete, leaving us miraculously guiltless in the eyes of the history that we construct. Actually, how guiltless we are, you can test from your own recent experience. You're all beneficiaries of a good education. I'm sure that, like most people, you were paying a lot of attention last November to stories coming from a county in Florida. The date line was Seminole County, Florida. That was the scene of various electoral shenanigans. You can now carry out an experiment. You can ask yourselves how you would have reacted if there was an election in Germany now and everyone was focusing their eyes on electoral shenanigans in, say, Kike County, Bavaria. If you can imagine that, you're looking in the mirror. You might, if you don't know why, you ought to find out why. That's back to John Quincy Adams, in fact. Let's go back to all of these are just among the prerequisites of power. You're powerful, you're allowed to do these things. These are illustrations of the truisms that I mentioned. Well, let's look at the question a little bit more generally, back off a little. Actually, the question has been addressed at a very question of whether this will lead to self-destruction. I'm now giving an interpretation of an article that didn't interpret what he said the way I do, but I think it applies. The general question was addressed by the grand old man of American biology, Ernst Mayr of Harvard. He wrote an article a couple of years ago on the adaptive value of higher intelligence, and he was pretty skeptical about it. His reasons were that he said we've had about 50 billion species since the origin of life, only one of which achieved the intelligence needed to establish a civilization. It did so very recently in a very small breeding group from which we're all descended. Probably were lots of other close relatives, but they're gone, probably exterminated, along with big mammals. Anyhow, that's what's left, and that's the one exception. He concludes, Mayr, that this kind of evolutionary accident is not favored by selection. The history of life on Earth, he says, refutes the claim that it's better to be smart than stupid. The successful organisms are stupid. They are adapted to very narrow ecological niches, beetles, bacteria, actually phage, which are in mass, I suppose, the most successful. Capacity for rapid mutation helps. Mayr adds the rather somber observation that the average life expectancy of a species on Earth is about 100,000 years. It's just about the lifespan of the one species that most radically broke the pattern, and now faces the question of whether it's better to be smart than stupid. That's the question I'm asking. Well, the species is certainly smart enough to have developed the capacity to destroy itself, no doubt about that. And it's also demonstrated that capacity quite consistently throughout history, quite dramatically so in the past several hundred years, with an assault on the environment that sustains life, on the diversity of more complex organisms, and on each other as well. Just the last century, there were about 100 million deaths which are directly attributable to war. The last decade, contrary to what's often said, brought nothing new. The consequences of the collapse of the British and the French and the Portuguese empires were far more destructive than what followed the collapse of the East European tyrannies, and in fact those still remain very prominently on the front pages today, decades later. That's contrary to what's commonly claimed, but that takes us back to the truisms I mentioned earlier. Many of the conflicts of the past decade can be attributed to an enemy empire that collapsed, leaving a terrible legacy, namely the Soviet Union. So therefore, those atrocities are real, as distinct from the legacy of our friends and allies, which is incomparably worse, but not real by virtue of the historical truism that of immunity of power and privilege from inspection. Even though the 90s were not unusual, and in fact less destructive than the collapse of earlier empires, Western empires, and even though the number of interstate conflicts has declined quite sharply through the 90s, nevertheless it wasn't a pretty decade. By 1998, internal to state, interstate conflicts had left about 5 million dead, 10 million refugees, 5 million people internally displaced. 40% of those are in Colombia, where the regular increase, about 300,000 a year, of the past decade is expected to accelerate pretty sharply as Washington's war moves into full gear. It's Clinton's Plan Colombia. And that's in addition to over 1 million who just fled the country. More ominously still, the kind of intelligence needed to establish a civilization, to which Ernst Mayr referred, it has constructed particular kinds of dominant civilizations, and they are based on institutional structures that do increase the likelihood of dreadful outcomes. The most obvious example is just the international system, which is designed in such a way, structured in such a way that it tends to enhance an apparently inexorable drive to adapt modern technology to the most destructive ends. Nuclear weapons are the most threatening example, and in deference to the principle of looking at ourselves, we might attend to our own, the situation right here. The primacy assigned to nuclear weapons in the highest level strategic planning of the Clinton years. And there's a reason, so quoting from documents of the Strategic Command, highest level planning group. They say, unlike chemical or biological weapons, the extreme destruction from a nuclear explosion is immediate, with few or any palliatives to reduce its effect. So therefore, the planners recommend that nuclear weapons be visibly available, because although we are not likely to use nuclear weapons in less than matters of the greatest national importance, which is reassuring, I suppose, nevertheless, they cast a shadow over every crisis or conflict. Furthermore, it's beneficial for our strategic posture if some elements of government may appear to be potentially out of control, that the United States may become irrational and vindictive if its vital interests are attacked, should be a part of the national persona we project. That's what's called credibility in public discourse. And it's projected. The world is very frightened, including Europe. The U.S. must therefore reject the basic principle of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, namely that nuclear powers make a good faith effort to eliminate nuclear weapons, and the U.S. must retain them as the basis for our strategic posture. That includes the right of first use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear powers which have signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's all very explicit. In any country that valued its freedom, this would be all over the front pages and would have been for years since it's been declassified. The basic conclusions have been approved in presidential directives, Clinton directives. They authorize first use, and they maintain nuclear weapons in launch on warning posture that perpetuates a high alert regime of the past years with the ever-present danger to survival. There are new programs that are being initiated to implement these decisions. There is a change in the post-Cold War period. So the Pentagon, its own internal documents, right after the Cold War ended, recommended and has implemented a change from targeting primarily what it called the weapons-rich environment of the Soviet Union to the target-rich environment of the rest of the world, the third world, which has actually been the main target of U.S. military action right throughout the Cold War and is remaining so, apart from some modification of pretexts that the Cold War required. It's a major change since the end of the Cold War is change of pretexts and elimination of a deterrent to U.S. violence. And it's even made pretty explicit. More evidence that it may not be better to be smart than stupid is the National Missile Defense Program. There's a standard criticism of this, namely that it would be useless, since there are easy modes of delivery that don't require missiles. Graham Allison, who's leading strategic analyst over at the Harvard Kennedy School, pointed out that if terrorists wanted to smuggle a nuclear warhead into New York City, all they'd have to do is wrap it in a bale of marijuana. Another common argument is that they won't work. That's the standard criticism. It's not going to work. A much more dangerous possibility is that it might work, or that it might even appear to be working. Remember that in issues of survival, like nuclear strategy, appearance has got to be interpreted as reality. Can't take any chances. So if there's any possibility that it might work, it's extremely dangerous. As long as it's not going to work, it's just a waste of, it's just a way to fund high-tech industry. If it looks as if it might work, however, then it's really dangerous. And U.S. intelligence estimates have been pretty clear about this. They've predicted that the deployment of a national missile defense that looks feasible is, I'm quoting now, is going to impel China to develop new nuclear-armed missiles, expanding its nuclear arsenal by a factor of 10, prompting India and Pakistan to respond with their own buildups with a likely ripple effect to the Middle East. These same analyses and plenty of others point out that the Russians' only rational response would be to maintain and strengthen the existing Russian nuclear force. U.S. negotiators, Clinton-era negotiators, in fact encouraged Russia to adopt a launch-on-warning strategy themselves. The idea was to alleviate Russian concerns and to induce them to accept the national missile defense and the revision of the ABM treaty. That's a proposal that's pretty bizarre, one expert commented, because we know their warning system is full of holes, so it simply maximizes the threat to us and everyone else. There was a UN conference on the Non-Proliferation Treaty last May. It was very broad, in fact, universal condemnation of the national missile defense on grounds that it would undermine decades of arms control agreements, provoke a new weapons race, but both political parties in the United States are committed to it, though at different rates. Very few, including allies, pay much attention to the tales about rogue states. Canadian military planners, for example, advised the government that the goal of the national missile defense is more to preserve U.S. NATO freedom of action than because the United States really fears North Korean or Iranian threats. It's declassified briefings. Well, the reasons commonly given for this are the pressure of military industry and so on, which could be. I suspect myself, and I don't prove it, that a non-trivial factor in this may be traced back again to cultural patterns. In particular, a kind of a curious paranoid streak in American culture, which may well be the result of centuries of victories against much weaker enemies, facing no military threat since the War of 1812. So the bully in the schoolyard may well come to fear that everyone hates him for some reason. As compared with other countries, there are remarkably high levels of fear in the United States. That's of all sorts of things. Crime, terrorism, aliens among us, Judgment Day, just about anything you can think of except for the real threats to the United States and the world, which are high and probably increasing. Now that would be something of a problem if we were talking about Afghanistan, but we're not. It's vastly more significant when we're talking about the most advanced civilization that intelligence has been able to create and the most dominant. Well, these global concerns are not alleviated by other U.S. stands. Last November 1999, the United States blocked the UN General Assembly resolution opposing space-based weapons. It was passed 138 to 0, the U.S. and Israel alone abstaining, but a U.S. abstention is a veto. 2 years earlier, the U.S. Space Command published what it called its vision for the year 2020, which called for what they call full spectrum dominance, including control of space, military control, in order to protect U.S. interests and investments. Well, there are plenty of threats in the world, but the major problems lie right at home and hence are within the sphere of our influence and control, which brings us right back to the truisms that I mentioned at the outset. Well, again, a lot more to say about this, but let's turn to another domain. So consider something nice and mild, not nuclear weapons, neoclassical markets. Markets in which isolated individuals seek only to maximize a particular form of self-interest, and certainly a form that's consciously constructed with very great effort, with perceptions instituted by vast industries that are devoted to implanting and reinforcing them. In the United States, about 1/6 of gross domestic product, that's well over $1 trillion a year, is devoted to marketing. Much of it is just manipulation and control, trying to institute these values, starting with infancy. Well, these constructed systems have a number of well-known problems. One is that unborn generations who are going to face the consequences have no vote in the market, from which it follows that their interests count as zero in the market system. They don't enter into consideration in a well-functioning market. That alone tends to undermine the possibilities of the sustainable development on which survival relies. these threats are currently being enhanced very consciously by dedicated efforts to weaken the institutional structures that might address these externalities, as they're called. And even more important, to undermine the culture of sympathy and solidarity that sustains them. Now, this last commitment, I think, is pretty important. I believe it's the driving force behind the propaganda efforts that are designed to undermine popular support for healthcare systems of the kind that are found in other industrial societies, and to create a largely artificial sense of crisis about the schools and Social Security, and in fact about any institutions that rely on the dangerous sentiment that we might care about somebody else, not just ourselves. The Social Security scam has other roots, and it's a scam. Take a look if you don't believe it. Whatever one thinks about transferring Social Security to stocks, to the stock market, there are two consequences which are absolutely clear and undebatable. One is that it's a huge bonanza for Wall Street. Another is that it entails that working people are going to end up with a tremendous stake in the value of stocks, the stocks on which their survival, post-retirement survival, depends on the survival of their families. That means that working people will have a strong reason to oppose decent wages and working conditions, health and safety standards in the workplace, the social and economic rights that are given formal endorsement in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but which the U.S. strongly opposes, and other principles that are naturally despised by the unaccountable private tyrannies that dominate the domestic and the international society in close alliance with one another and the powerful states that they largely dominate. That's another prescription for disaster, and not so in such a long term. Well, it's commonly claimed that there's a huge payoff for these problems, what's called globalization or the new economy or free markets or other terms of propaganda, I believe, referring to the social and economic policies of the past 20-odd years. According to the story, they have led to unprecedented economic growth, though unfortunately a few have been left behind and we have to do something about that, all led by the spectacular fairy tale economy of the United States. You've read this 1,000 times. So take, say, the most critical voice in the New York Times, Anthony Lewis, on March 10th. He informed us that, I'm quoting, "The greatest economic boom in America's history, in fact in the world's history, came in the 1990s. What is Lewis referring to? He's referring to the fact that an unusually slow recovery from the recession of the early 90s was compensated by a growth spurt in the last few years that brought the growth rate for the 90s to about the level of the rather dismal 20 years that preceded it. All of that is well below the level of economic growth or productivity growth in the first, what many economists call the golden age of Western capitalism. That's from World War II up till the mid-1970s. It was in the mid-1970s that the Bretton Woods system of regulated capital was dismantled, and the new era of globalization and neoliberalism was instituted, bringing with it, uncontroversially, a substantial deterioration in macroeconomic indicators wherever the rules were followed, including the United States. Furthermore, even the relatively anemic growth in the United States through the 90s was unusual in that it left out most of the population. I don't know if there's earlier period in U.S. history of which that's true. During the golden age, prior to neoliberalism, during the golden age, wages and benefit rose very rapidly across the board. Just to give you some figures, from 1947 to 1973, real wages rose 75%. From 1973 to 1998, they fell 9%, back to the level of 1967. Furthermore, it was level growth in the Golden Age. In fact, the lowest quintile had the highest growth rate, and the highest quintile had the lowest, and benefits and so on went along with it. During the globalization phase, the benefits of the much slower growth are very highly skewed. Even after the growth spurt of the late 90s, the male median wages are below 1989, peak of the last business cycle. For a large majority of the population, they're well below the 1970s. Family incomes have been more or less sustained, but that's by a far heavier workload. In fact, the heaviest in the industrial world by the early 1990s. Take Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, median income declined by, half above, half below, declined by about 10% in the 1990s. It was even steeper decline in Connecticut. In California, purchasing power per family dropped about $1,000 during the 1990s, according to a recent Federal Reserve Bank of California report. Notice that these are the stars of the new economy, real fancy places. Social indicators have been declining since the mid-1970s. Before that, they rose, kind of tracking gross domestic product. They've been declining since. They're now about the level of 40 years ago. The poverty levels, approximately like 20 years ago. It's the highest in the industrial world. Second is England, the other country that's more or less kept to the neoliberal rules. Furthermore, even this much less than impressive economic performance is very fragile. In fact, everybody knows that now. It's fueled mainly by consumer spending. The consumer spending is stimulated by fanatic propaganda efforts. One consequence of it is that it's led to unprecedented debt, household debt past disposable income last year for the first time in American history, and also a huge trade deficit. Now, the trade deficit is not much of a problem for policymakers. Two MIT Nobel laureates had an op-ed in the Times about that, retired economics professors yesterday, and they're right. It's not. They talked about the threat of the deficit. It's not much of a problem to policymakers, but they didn't point out that it's a major problem for the population. If you look at polls, it's been the most important economic issue for the population for some years. It doesn't enter into political campaigns at all, but that's for another reason. That's because this is an issue on which the business community has one view and the population has another view. And such issues cannot enter into the political arena in our democratic society because of the way it's structured. But if you look at polls, the trade deficit and capital mobility generally, people don't call it that, but that's what we're talking about, is the leading economic issue because people understand that it's a threat to job quality and job security, as indeed it is. These problems are worldwide. They're not just the U.S. So the executive secretary of the Economic Commission of Latin America and the Caribbean, Jose Antonio Ocampo, he gave a talk at the American Economic Society in January in which he reviewed the record for Latin America. He's been a kind of a booster for this system for years. And he pointed out that trade and investment did increase during the prescribed reforms, but he says the enthusiastic predictions have turned out to be a mirage. Latin America, he points out, is the region where the reforms were most strictly enforced. And growth fell under the reforms to a little over half the level of the 3 decades of state-led economic development from the 1950s through the 1970s, before pre-liberalization and globalization. In contrast, he points out, the one success story of the new era is East Asia and China, where the regimes dramatically didn't follow the rules. Furthermore, though he didn't point this out, this is fully consistent with 2 centuries of economic history, including the United States. It's an interesting story, too long to review here. So what leads Anthony Lewis and other commentators to such curious fantasies? Well, you can guess the reason. Narrow circles have indeed benefited enormously, and that includes the folks who tell everyone else the happy news. people like us, and the circles in which we live, for the most part, are doing fine, spectacularly. Well, if you keep to the approved modern doctrine that nothing matters except me, the conclusions are not all that strange, however outlandish they are in fact. Let me stress that this is a modern doctrine. These doctrines would have appalled Adam Smith and other founders of classical liberalism. In fact, they're a major assault on Enlightenment values, as is the structure of the dominant institutions. Concentrations of unaccountable private power, unaccountable to the public, of course, administering and controlling markets in violation of market principles, controlling, in fact, owning the doctrinal institutions, and with an overwhelming influence on the powerful states and international institutions, the ones that modestly call themselves the international community. What are the expectations for the future? Well, we have expert predictions about that too. The U.S. intelligence community, with specialists from the academic and world and private sector, they just published a report on predictions for the year 2015, and they give several scenarios. The most optimistic scenario that they give is that globalization proceeds on course, and in that case they say its evolution will be rocky, marked by chronic financial volatility and a widening economic divide. Well, financial volatility means slower growth and less productive long-term investment. And a widening economic divide means less convergence to a global market, that is, to a single price and wage. So what they're predicting is less globalization in the technical sense, but more globalization in the doctrinally approved sense, which doesn't have anything to do with globalization, but has to do with capital mobility and investor rights. That's the most optimistic scenario. Then there's some bad ones. For Latin America, their prediction is that the oil producers, Mexico, Venezuela, and Brazil, ought to do all right, but most others will fall behind, in fact, very badly behind. Mexico and Brazil, however, will be, I'm quoting, increasingly confident and capable actors. That's an interesting comment, because they certainly know that Mexico and Brazil have the highest equality in the world. So they're not talking about Mexico and Brazil. They're not going to be confident and capable actors, rather small sectors within Mexico and Brazil, which happen to be linked to international capital. They're going to be separated from the rest by an increasing divide, according to the best-case scenario of the experts. Mexico is a particularly interesting case. It's described as the star pupil of Latin America. And the reason is it's been following the rules of the so-called Washington Consensus, neoliberal rules for 20 years, and also it had the extra advantage of benefiting from NAFTA since 1994. So what happened? Well, for the last 20 years, wages have steadily declined, probably about 50% by 1990, another 25% decline since NAFTA. That includes a 10% decline even in the manufacturing industries, which are supposed to be the best performers. Poverty levels are up 10% since NAFTA. They're now increasing at about twice the level of the population. Income inequality has deepened. Economic power is more concentrated. I'll quote from a recent study of the Latin American section of the Woodrow Wilson Center. 50 firms account for half the exports. 20 corporate groups control 3/5 of the national economic output. Small Mexican companies face nearly insurmountable financing costs. Trade and farming continue to shed excess workers. Labor-intensive industries, which is almost everything there, agriculture, light industry, can't compete internationally. All of these costs, incidentally, are radically underestimated because of the highly ideological method of estimating economic costs. It's not neutral. So not counted here are the costs of the huge flow of migrant workers trying to survive, coming to the United States where they work at very low wages, no benefits, awful conditions, that leads to destruction of lives and communities on a vast scale in Mexico. There's no way to estimate those costs, and they aren't counted. They're not considered costs in economic analysis. The same Woodrow Wilson Foundation Center report goes on to say that for U.S. consumers, this is a bonanza. They say the consumption of U.S. consumers is subsidized by the impoverishment of farm laborers both in the United States and Mexico. The United States is in fact exporting its slums, something which Europe has been doing for years, what they call guest workers. Keep the slums in Turkey and Morocco, we'll take the cheap labor. All of this in Mexico is contrary to predictions that relied on theoretically sound models, which, however, had a few gaps. They didn't take into account the effect, which was brought to the attention of planners but disregarded. They didn't take account of the effect of the enormous flow of peasants to the cities, as highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness exports flood Mexican markets and, of course, destroy agricultural production. Exactly the same thing happened in Haiti. Remember that Haiti is considered the prize example of the Clinton doctrine of restoring democracy. And indeed, the elected president was allowed to return, but after several years of U.S.-backed terror, he was allowed to return on some conditions. One condition was that Haiti open its markets to U.S. exports, including U.S. rice exports, which are very highly subsidized, especially went very high, especially during the Reagan administration, to about 40% of profits. The Reagan administration was the most anti-market administration in post-war U.S. history. This is only one example, though it was full of passionate rhetoric about the wonders of market discipline for the poor. That's another generalization that's pretty well established historically, and in fact it accounts for quite a lot of the structure of today's international economy. Well, the result of this was all perfectly predictable, in fact predicted. U.S. aid in 1995 in Haiti pointed out that this is going to relentlessly squeeze the small farmer, which of course it did. You know, poor Haitian farmers can't compete with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness, so they went out of business. Haiti's rice production was destroyed. Haiti's now a leading importer of U.S. rice. Rice production feeds back into the whole economy in all sorts of ways, so that's a big attack on the whole economy, which suffered another blow. It was already battered by a century of U.S. rule and an awful history before. The same technique was used to destroy one of Haiti's very few native industries, namely chicken parts production. That was destroyed by by the dumping of dark meat by U.S. agribusiness. Turns out that U.S. consumers don't like dark meat, so there's, Tyson and those guys have a lot of extra dark meat, and what's better to do with it than dump it on Haiti, destroying that industry. They tried it on Canada, but Canada blocked it with high tariffs. It's a functioning country. Haiti can't do that because of the restoration of democracy, which was conditioned on accepting open markets, that is, accepting the position of the U.S. presidential candidate in the last elections who received 14% of the votes, but that is now forced by the U.S. occupation. That's known as democracy. We praise ourselves for that. Technically, Haiti could impose anti-dumping sanctions on the United States. It's allowed under World Trade Organization rules, just as the United States can impose sanctions on Haiti. That's known as equality, stands alongside of democracy. Well, let's return to Mexico. There's a recent study reported in the New York Times business section. It concludes that middle-class Mexicans have less purchasing power than they did 20 years ago. I was talking about the poor. This is the more wealthy, not the super wealthy who are doing great. But the study expects that things are going to improve now as President Fox, the president, shifts the tax burden to the poor, with taxes on food and medicine expected to be the largest component of new revenue, I'm quoting. The report assures us that Mexico's problems are in the past. Mexico now suffers what they call the curse of abundance. in a flourishing market-driven economy of the years of reform and NAFTA, which is not entirely false if we disregard the overwhelming majority of the population. Recent years have seen a very effective assault on democracy, a very conscious and effective one, assuming now that democracy has something to do with the ability of people to have some say in the decisions about things that matter to them. In fact, financial liberalization is designed to be a major assault on democracy for reasons that are well understood. That's what inaugurated the new era. It led to an astronomical increase in short-term speculative capital that did pretty clearly have the effect of harming the economy. The evidence is reasonably clear on that. But there's no controversy at all about its effect in undermining democracy. Rapid, huge financial flows, short-term flows, create what some economists call a dual constituency conundrum, meaning governments now have an extra constituency in addition to voters. The constituent, the new one, is investors and lenders, quoting, who carry out a moment-by-moment referendum on government policies. They reject the policies they don't like by capital flight and attacks on the currency, which are not resistible. And what they don't like is policies that are designed for the benefit of the population rather than for raising profits for the rich and powerful. There are further attacks on democracy that are underway right now in the negotiations of the past several years for the General Agreement on Trade and Services in Geneva and the free trade area for the Americas up and down the hemisphere. These have been conducted in secret for the last couple of years by trade ministers and business leaders. The media don't report it. Actually, had a friend do a survey, and it's kind of amazing to see the discipline. The reason is pretty clear. They're not reported because it's well understood that the population is going to be very strongly opposed if the facts ever leak out, as they may, maybe at the Quebec summit 10 days from now. It depends on whether activists can force them out. Some of this, we can't really be certain about the details because it's in secret, but a fair amount of information has come out from Canadian government and other sources, and you can be pretty sure about what it is. The notion of trade and services is just Orwellism. There's no trade and services. Trade and services is a reference to handing over governmental functions to private powers. That's called trade and services. What are services? Well, just about anything that, any function that might fall within the arena of democratic choice is a service. So education, health, water, energy, transportation, you go on. These have to be transferred to unaccountable private power. They have to be moved out of the public arena into the hands of private tyrannies. That has to be done in one or another way. One means is what's called Chapter 11 in NAFTA. It's a section of NAFTA that allows corporations. They couldn't drive it through the World Trade Organization because there's too much opposition, but it's in NAFTA, and it'll certainly be in the free trade area of the Americas. It allows corporations to sue government for actions which are, phrase is, tantamount to expropriation. That means government measures which might affect potential profits, like, for example, health or environmental regulations or funding of public schools and postal services. Investment that's targeted to the needs of communities or minorities or women or the elderly. In short, targeted to people, what's called special interests in contemporary jargon. They stand in contrast to the national interest, which is the interests of business. These efforts are enhanced by some imaginative new legal doctrines that have been devised by radical judicial activists who call themselves conservatives since the Reagan years. The main idea has been to reinterpret this thing called the Takings Clause in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. What it says is that, if the government builds a road in your backyard, they've got to compensate you for it. That's been extended now to include what are called regulatory takings. That is, governmental measures which might affect future profit. hence are tantamount to expropriation. Well, it's impossible to ram such measures through legislatures, at least if the public is awake. So the best idea is to bury them in so-called free trade agreements, which have nothing to do with free trade. There they can maybe be ferreted out by dedicated researchers, or of course by the corporate lawyers who are designing the system and the whole institutional structure that is likely to undermine fundamental rights that have been, that people have fought hard to attain over centuries, with consequences for future generations that are not very delightful to contemplate. Well, I'll skip lots of things. This barely skims the surface. Let me just end by returning to the truisms with which I began. Basic one is that power and privilege confer responsibility, and they also offer temptations that make it extremely easy to evade that responsibility. These are choices that people like us face, or ignore if we like. For other people, they're much harder, just because of the concentration of privilege. That's obvious. A refusal to face those choices, well, that's certainly the easy way, at least in the short term. In the longer term, it may very well refute the belief that it's better to be smart than stupid. It may show that humans are, in fact, an evolutionary error, destined to use their 100,000 years to destroy themselves and, in the process, much else. A couple of mics here. Anybody wants to add some uplifting remarks? Yeah.
I just wonder if you could give any advice or framework for people who actually do break through the propaganda web of information and do find out what's really going on, how they cannot feel totally disempowered that they're just one person.
All up there. Join the MIT Social Justice Group, or wherever you happen to be. Plenty you can do. All of this stuff is in our hands, I mean, none of it is inevitable. There's a very good reason why it's all done in secret and why there's so much massive lying about it. It's extremely well understood, very consciously understood, that you can never get this stuff through an informed public. In fact, you just read the business press. They are very frank about it. So, for example, when you may recall a couple of years ago, fast track was voted down. It was kind of interesting. Fast track is always presented as a free trade issue. It's got absolutely nothing to do with free trade. It has to do with democracy. Fast track means that if you have fast track authority, it means that the president the executive can make decisions in secret, international economic agreements, and then Congress can rubber stamp them without discussion. That's fast track. What's it got to do with free trade? I mean, it has to do with free trade only under one assumption, that the decisions that are going to be made will not withstand public discussion. In that respect, it has to do with, actually has nothing to do with free trade because the decisions aren't free trade agreements. That's fast track, and this was considered a disaster when it wasn't passed. Why wasn't it passed? The media were 100% in favor of it. It was called a no-brainer, so obvious. The business world, of course, was totally in favor of it. The government obviously was in favor of it. The intellectual world was in favor of it. The population hated it. People were banging on the doors of their local representatives and so on. Finally, they just had to vote against it. When they did vote against it, the Wall Street Journal had an article in which they called it a tragedy. And they said the problem is that the opponents of fast track have what they called, this nice phrase, an uncontrollable weapon or something like that. Namely, the population was opposed. It's just a weapon that we got to do something about. Well, there's something to do about it, and that is to keep it secret. That's why the negotiations go on in secret, and that tells you exactly what can be done. If you make it public, and do something about it. You know, as long as people are totally isolated, like each guy is sitting alone somewhere, it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't matter what they know. If they're organized, which they can be, it's a free country after all in many respects, so they can be organized and they can just stop it. You know? And in fact reverse the whole process. I mean, there's nothing in this that's fixed. A couple of MIT professors just published a book, an interesting book on multinational corporations, which was about, they're trying to look at whether they really are international or are they actually national, and their conclusion is they're basically national as they've always been. But they end up the book by pointing out that although the Anglo-American system is designed with corporations having responsibility only to stockholders, there's nothing inevitable about that, and nothing in the, you know, nothing in economics tells you that or anything else. They can be accountable to what are called stakeholders, which means everybody, the communities, the workforce, and others. And in fact, at that point, they stop being, you know, unaccountable collectivist legal entities. They become, if it continues, just you know, democratically controlled institutions. There's nothing to stop that. In fact, there's no point in this whole story where it has to go on. And the same is true of the other array of things. I mean, take, you know, the national missile defense is going to go through with raising a very serious hazard to everybody. But, you know, that one would really be easy to stop. I mean, an organized political effort would be enough to stop that one. It doesn't even take institutional change because it's so totally insane. In fact, I didn't go into this, but if you take a look at the current what's been done in the last couple of months, it's really mind-boggling, and it's kind of it's the reason why Europe is so terrified. It's not just the rest of the world, but now Europe too. The Bush administration is trying very hard to enhance the dangers. I mean, one of the big dangers, which I didn't mention, is Russia. You know, since Russia collapsed 10 years ago, something which we had a lot to do with, not the collapse itself, but what happened since, it has been a total disaster. You know, one of the worst catastrophes in human history, outside of plague or, you know, massive war. Huge demographic catastrophe. In fact, the country's undergoing what's called Latin Americanization without the explanation of what that means. Why is Latin America Latin America? Yeah. Well, that's why Russia is undergoing Latin Americanization. It's going back to what it was before 1917, namely a poor third world country, kind of like Latin America. So it's becoming like the other countries that we've been running forever. And of course, that's a disaster, huge disaster. But this is a country which, you know, has nuclear weapons and, you know, delivery systems and so on. And part of the disaster is they're all collapsing. The command and control systems are deteriorating, the nuclear protection systems are deteriorating, you know, nuclear submarines can blow up, I mean, you know, the whole place is rusting away and so on. That's really a danger. You know, it's a danger to everybody. Well, there are constructive proposals, but they're not even on the agenda. In fact, what we're doing is trying to make it worse. The Clinton administration had a small program to try to help the Russians, you know, get rid of nuclear weapons and to transfer nuclear scientists to other activities. The Bush administration just cut it back. You know, they want to enhance the danger to survival, and that makes sense. You know, if you think about functioning in a market system, which is what they do, you're really interested in, you know, the bottom line next quarter. I mean, what happens a year from now is somebody else's business. You know, it doesn't make any difference. And there are better ways to make short-term profit and power. So, you know, if the world blows up, it's somebody else's problem. The same is true with the North Korean business. I mean, the Bush administration is one of the good things that Clinton did. I don't like him. In fact, I despise him, but there were some good things. And one of the good things was kind of calming things down on the Korean Peninsula. Well, the Bush administration wants to heat it up. So they're trying to enhance the Korean threat, such as it is. They've tried to stop, and in fact probably have stopped Kim Dae-jung, the South Korean president, from taking steps to reach further accommodation on the peninsula. They want hostility and danger. In fact, that's what they would love is a Korean attack. And the basic reason is they don't have any other excuse for the national missile defense. If it's not North Korean missiles, what are we doing? You know, Nobody in the world takes that seriously, but they got to get the American people to take it seriously. Okay, you know, these are all things that are under control. They're not happening in outer space.
In 1989, an article was published in National Interest about arguing that the end of history has come with the collapse of communism in Germany, and the battle of ideas has been won in favor of liberal bourgeois democracy. And sometimes I see this as one of the mechanisms that people on the side of liberal bourgeois democracy use as a propaganda item to support their cause. Do you think really the battle of ideas has finished?
Well, you have to understand. Yeah, that's Fukuyama, who then wrote a big book about it. But you have to look back a little to decode what's going on here. Let's go back to 1917. Okay, Russia was a deeply impoverished third world country. It had been declining relative to the West for about 5 centuries. You go back 5 centuries ago, Europe was more or less, you know, barbarians all over the place. At that point, in fact, one of those backward areas of the world. But around then, Western Europe began to develop. There was kind of a fault line, which actually runs pretty much down East Germany. And the East became what we would now call its third world, you know, the third world then. But the East became kind of like a colonial backwater for developing Western Europe, and this deepened right into the early 20th century. There was a difference between Russia and, say, you know, Central Africa. The difference was, even as a very impoverished third world country, Russia had a big army. So like in the 19th century, in the 18th century, it was a military force. It wasn't anything else, but it was a military force. So deeply impoverished third world country with a military force. If you read, you know, Tolstoy's novels and so on, the rich guys, the aristocracy, they're talking French, right? Not Russian. The intellectual culture was tied to the West. There was some development in the country almost entirely owned by the West. I mean, this is typical third world patterns. In 1917, they sort of pulled themselves out of that. There was a nationalist revolution, didn't have anything to do with socialism, which sort of pulled the country out of its third world status and instituted a very brutal developmental state, you know, and it worked. I mean, the country developed very fast. In fact, the main concern of the United States and Britain right into the 1960s, you can see it in the classified documents, is that Russian growth rate is too fast. You know, they're developing too fast, they're going to become a model for other countries and so on. That kind of stagnated in the 1960s, partly because of Kennedy's huge military programs and his refusal to accept Russian offers for disarmament. And that's the point at which the Russian economy started to stagnate, you know, then by the 1980s kind of declined and then collapsed. Well, when it collapsed, it went back to what it was. But that's normal, you know. I mean, the same, just like what I described about Nicaragua. Nicaragua tried to lift itself out of third world dependency around the late 70s. U.S. wouldn't tolerate it, crushed them. Took 10 years in the case of Nicaragua. And now it's being driven back to much worse than it was before, because they have to be punished, remember. You're not allowed to do this. So now they're, you know, down to second worst in the hemisphere. And there's case after case of this. Guatemala's another case. You know, Grenada's a case. I mean, it's just the history of North-South relations. The main concern always is that it might succeed. It might succeed in its own terms, and nobody cares about human rights or anything like that. It might look successful and be a model for others. That runs right through the record. Same was true of the Soviet Union. At the time of the Russian Revolution, there was deep concern, not because Russia was going to conquer anybody, I mean, you know, barely could survive, but because they would succeed. So Woodrow Wilson and his Secretary of State Lansing, you read their discussions, they were concerned that returning Negro soldiers would be inspired by the fact that a revolution took place and would begin to, you know, ask for things for themselves. Negro laundresses were asking for higher wages. Wilson was afraid. Mine workers in Wales were pressing for organization and higher wages. Lloyd George was terribly upset about that. And they were really afraid of successful development. Now, what developed has having nothing to do with socialism. I mean, Lenin himself was opposed to socialism. I mean, he was in favor of it in some abstract sense, but not for Russia. He's a Marxist, after all, an Orthodox Marxist. If you know the religion, a revolution has to take place in the most advanced industrial country because of the iron laws of history and the social relations of production and all this stuff. He was looking for a revolution in Germany, most advanced industrial country. When he took over Russia, they were carrying out a holding action, waiting for the revolution in Germany. Well, there was a revolution in Germany in 1919. It was crushed. At that point, they were stuck with this third world country on their hands. So they moved right away to a state capitalist economy. It's called the New Economic Policy, straight state capitalist, tough, kind of like what Park instituted in Korea, a tough developmental state, basically totalitarian, drive the population to forced industrialization and development. The connection to socialism is zero. I mean, in fact, about the first thing that Lenin and Trotsky did when they took power after the Bolshevik revolution or coup or whatever you want to call it, first thing they did was dismantle the socialist institutions. They got rid of the factory councils and the Soviets. They got rid of the Constituent Assembly because it was mostly based on peasant revolutionary parties. And they simply instituted domination by a vanguard party and a maximal leader. It's got nothing to do with socialism. In fact, they were very sharply attacked by the mainstream Marxists, who are now marginalized because they lost. So you lose, you disappear from history. But the mainstream Marxist intellectuals were very sharply condemning this. They were considered left, Lenin condemned them as ultra-leftists because they were insisting on socialist principles, but he wasn't. Now then comes the following interesting development. There are two major propaganda systems in the world in the 20th century. One is the Anglo-American system, which is just overwhelming. Nobody even came close. That's the dominant propaganda system. Then there was a second, much smaller propaganda system, the Russian system, much weaker, much less credible, much smaller. They disagreed on an awful lot of things, but there's one thing they agreed on, that Russia was socialist. And they agreed for opposite reasons. The Russian propaganda system wanted to pretend this in obvious violation of the facts, to try to get whatever, because of the moral appeal of socialism, which was enormous. So if they could associate themselves somehow with it and, decolonization and so on, they get some points for it. The Anglo-American system wanted to do it in order to defame socialism. Very simple. So you have a huge propaganda system and a small propaganda system insisting on the same idiotic claim, and it became conventional. I mean, you have to think for 5 minutes to see that it doesn't make any sense, and who wants to do that? But when the system collapsed, it's just like the end of any other North-South conflict. It was kind of like the end of the war against Nicaragua or Grenada or anybody else. This one took 70 years. Like I said, it was a third world country with a big army, but it went the same way as it usually does, just a reflection of power. And now most of Eastern Europe is going back to what it was. I mean, the parts of Eastern Europe that were part of the West, like say the Czech Republic, it's becoming part of the West. Western Poland, which was actually Germany. They moved the borders around. That's becoming part of the West. Bulgaria is going back to what it was. Not as bad as what it was. I mean, it was really horrible. Like, peasants were using wooden plows in 1940. So it's not going back to that. But it's not relatively advanced industrial country like it was 15 years ago. You take a look at the quality of life statistics in, say, the Human Development Reports, you see it very clearly. They're going up in Russia until about the mid-'80s, 1989, then they start going way down, back down to the level of places like Latin America. So the claim about Latin Americanization is correct, it's just sort of missing the point. So going back to the conflict of ideas, there never was any. I mean, there was, you know, the state capitalist systems of the West had overwhelming dominance. Eastern Europe developed its own form of state capitalism, you know, somewhat different. It was a totalitarian command economy. There's not a hint of socialism in Eastern Europe, much more in the West, in fact. I remember the core of any kind of socialism, no matter what you are, the core conception was always control over production by producers. I mean, after that, you could start arguing, but that was the core idea. I mean, did you have that in Eastern Europe? I mean, ridiculous. You have more of it in Germany, you know. We have at least co-determination and unions and so on. So this is just total nonsense. Yeah, of course it was very fashionable nonsense because it enabled whoever the questioner was to, it enabled the conclusion that has been drawn. Gee, aren't we wonderful? We won the great battle of the 20th century, and now we march on to this, that, and the other thing. I mean, there were effects at the end of the Cold War. One effect was there was no longer any deterrent. So the U.S. is now able to use force without concern for any counterreaction. And that's one of the reasons why the Third World is so frightened. Another consequence of the end of the Cold War is that it eliminated the space for non-alignment. As long as you had two gangsters running the world, you know, a big gangster and a little gangster, there was some way to play off one against the other. If the little gangster is knocked off, you're only left with the big gangster. You don't have that space anymore. And it's visible. So, for example, take, say, foreign aid. I mean, it was always, you know, very slight. Since 1990, it's disappeared. I mean, in most countries it's declined. In the United States, it went to literally zero. And the United States has the lowest foreign aid per capita, level relative to the economy in the industrial world. And even that's a fraud because almost all of it's going to a rich country, namely Israel. Take that away, and there's almost nothing. And Egypt, because it's part of the Israel-Egypt system. Take that away, and there's essentially nothing. Well, why bother giving those guys even pennies, if we don't have to buy them off? I mean, all of this tells you quite a lot about the prevailing values. Just think about it. You can deduce something about the real values that Fukuyama is concealing. But it's much prettier to have that story.
One thing you might conclude from reading the New York Times the last few months is that there are major differences between a Bush administration and the previous Democratic administration, and that it's really we're in for a really difficult time with this we're in for a very difficult time with this new horrible Bush administration. You alluded to one, I think, potentially, arguably significant difference in terms of the relationship to what's happening on the Korean Peninsula, as you put it.
Yeah, there are others.
Are there others, and are those differences, in your view, significant enough to warrant, in some instances, supporting the Democratic Party as a less vicious alternative? And if not, if that's maybe a trap that we need to be careful to avoid falling into, how do you view the alternative as it was put forward in the recent election by Ralph Nader, that we need to go outside the duopoly, as he put it, and build an alternative progressive movement?
That's an actually independent issue, in my opinion. I mean, I think it would be extremely important to have an independent progressive movement, which would probably represent the majority of the population, judging by popular attitudes. That's important no matter what you think about, the electoral game. That's a separate question is how you should vote, or if you should vote on a particular day. That's a separate question. Okay? They're just two different questions. And you have to make different decisions. I mean, so for example, I think, I'll tell you my own opinion. My own opinion is that in states that say what was called tactical voting made a lot of sense. So if you're in a state like, say, Massachusetts, where the outcome is clear in advance, it's throwing away a vote to vote for Gore. It's a meaningful vote to vote for Nader because that's adding something to the popular alternative. On the other hand, if you're in a state where it's a swing state, well, then it's not so obvious. You have to balance two conflicting ideas. One, do you want the somewhat more vicious alternative, or how does that balance against building a force that'll function no matter who's in office? And you just have to choose. I should say that almost nothing, none of this had almost anything to do with the election. You know, if you take a look at the election, it was basically a coin toss, meaning that whatever the numbers were, they're well within the range of statistical error. So in effect, it was tossing a coin. And you know, there's just no way in which a population can break 50-50 on any issues. You know, it's inconceivable, even any collection of issues. So whatever was going on, people weren't voting on issues. And if you look at polls, that's very clear. There are intensive polls in the United States all the time. In fact, there's a project over at Harvard called the Vanishing Voter Project that monitors attitudes on elections very closely. You take a look at their studies and everything else. It turns out that about 75% of the population didn't think that an election took place at all. Literally. They simply thought there's no election. There's just some game going on between rich guys and party bosses and the public relations industry, which is crafting candidates. You can't believe a word they say if you can understand it. And there's just some game those guys are playing. You don't have anything to do with it. All right, that's 75% of the population. Of the part of the population that bothered to vote, when they were asked about issues, most couldn't figure out where the candidates stood on issues, and this is not stupidity. I mean, I didn't watch the debates, but I know people who did, including my wife, and you know, they couldn't figure out where they stood on most issues. In fact, it turns out that if you trace what people understood about issues, it declined through 2000, because as these guys talked more, talk means read what they were programmed to say by their handlers. None of them think. That's never allowed. You read what you're programmed to say by your handlers. That's what the PR industry's for. And what they were programmed to do was to look like nice guys, you know, and to fudge the issues. If there were issues that people really cared about, like, say, capital mobility, but the business community didn't like it, they're just off the agenda altogether, you know, period. The only issues that can even arise are things that the business world accepts. You know, then you can sort of talk about it. So, like, the business world doesn't care very much about choice, let's say. I mean, their wives and daughters are going to get abortions if they want it, no matter what. You know, even if you get the death penalty for it, they'll get them anyway. So they don't care. That's something for poor people. And how it's decided is not important, so you can have a big fuss about that. And a lot of other things that are called social issues. You know, I don't care about that. But when it gets to gut issues, you just can't talk about them because the business world is opposed to the population, so they're off the agenda. On the other hand, in the small range of issues where people could figure out where the candidates stood, and there weren't many, they were, I think it was about 2-to-1 pro-Gore. You know, and those very same people, if you look at them, didn't vote Democratic. Bush got the major electoral base for Bush was white working class, mostly men, but also women. And those are people who mostly opposed him on issues. Well, why? Is that irrational? No, it's not irrational. I mean, if you think there's no election going on, it's the game among the rich folk, and you bother to vote for some reason, you might as well do what the television set is telling you to do. Vote for qualities, not issues. You know, like, is this the kind of guy you'd like to meet in a bar, say? Is this the kind of guy you hated in 4th grade? You know, that kind of stuff. That's what the PR industry was crafting the whole thing about. They're called qualities, you know. And yeah, population understood, so they either didn't bother or they played the game. I mean, it's, you know, there was, the Nader effect was very marginal. And in fact, if you look at the outcome, kind of unpleasant. You take a look at where Nader's highest vote was. I don't know if you bothered looking. It was in, I think it was in Montana and Alaska. There he got really high numbers. Who are the guys voting for him in Montana and Alaska? Well, you know, those are the guys on mountaintops with assault rifles and tanks, you know, waiting for the feds to come and, or the aliens to come or something like that so they can kill them, you know. It's unfortunate, I'm afraid, but that's sort of what happened, which means that there's a big, you know, there's a big effort ahead. incidentally, this is called just a final word on this. You know, this is not a flaw of American democracy. This is a triumph of American democracy. This is the way the system was designed. You know, to go back to the Constitutional Convention, it was designed to have this property, that the population would be out of it, that the place would be run by what Madison called the wealth of the nation, and everybody else would be fragmented and doing some other thing. It's kind of been hard to achieve, you know, but it's kind of like a triumph of American democracy with all this, I think. Yeah.
Archer Daniels Midland has a beautiful ad campaign on during McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, and they just came out with a new one where they claim they're going to end children begging in the street for food. Do you think they're going to succeed?
Well, you know, it's kind of like I mean, what they're going to try to do is make as much profit as they can. It might turn out by the sheerest accident that that'll help people, or it might turn out that it'll harm people, but it's kind of irrelevant, you know. I mean, what's relevant is that they maximize profit. And it's not because they're bad guys, it's because they have to. I mean, the system is designed so that you must be a villain. You know, if you're not, you're out of the system. Like if there's any degree of competition, there isn't much competition in the system, it's mostly oligopoly, but to the extent that there's any competition, you must be as vicious as you can, otherwise you're just not going to be in the game. Like, you know, if you got two auto companies, I mean, right now there's two airplanes, civilian aircraft is the biggest export, and there's two companies in the world, Airbus and Boeing. Both of them are offshoots of governments. But to the extent that they're private companies, they have to undercut each other. I mean, if one of them starts being nice to the workforce, or, you know, making planes with more seats, or, you know, allowing the air to circulate so people don't die of pneumonia or something, if they do that, they're just going out of business, you know, and the other guy will win. I mean, it's an institutional imperative that you be a gangster. You may have seen, there was a kind of shocking article on the front page of the New York Times a couple of months ago about I don't remember the details, it was something like this. There's some drug that's used for, or, you know, it's made by some big firm for removing facial hair. Now, it turns out that that drug can cure sleeping sickness, you know, which hundreds of millions of people are dying from. And the only reason it's being produced is for facial hair for rich people. And the article was very irate about this. You know, these bad CEOs, aren't they awful? Why don't they care about the kids dying from sleeping sickness? It's true that it's criminal, but it's not the criminality of the CEOs. I mean, they are behaving exactly as they must behave. They don't behave that way, they're not CEOs anymore. It's an institutional criminality, which we're supposed to be in favor of. You know, so you're taught in schools and colleges that this is the best thing, to have institutional structures which turn you into a murderous criminal. You gotta, you know, that's one of these things you have to recognize. It's not that the people doing it are bad guys. So Archer Daniel Midlands, yeah, of course they're going to act in a criminal fashion, but if they don't, they're just no longer in business. The system is designed so that they act that way. There's a line around which you read in economics books where you quote Adam Smith as saying there's an invisible hand, which means if everybody pursues his own interest, it somehow turns out wonderful. I would advise you someday to look at what Adam Smith actually said. You know, I think you'd be interested. The phrase invisible hand appears once in Wealth of Nations, and it appears in a critique of capital mobility. That's somehow missing in the textbooks. He's talking about the fact that, he says, well, what about the possibility that you know, people with capital will invest somewhere else, some other country, and harm their own communities? He said, well, this probably isn't going to happen because the chances are that they'll feel more secure investing at home, and that will end up benefiting the community. And it says it sometimes happens, he says, that an invisible hand in which people are pursuing self-interest will actually help people. But that's part of his critique of capital mobility, you know. Somehow that disappeared in the textbooks. I don't know why. But you check back in That's around page 400 or so of book 1 of Wealth of Nations. You'll take a look at the index. It's easy to find because it only occurs once. You know? So it takes some real effort to misconstrue it in the way it's misconstrued. It's not the only case.
Hi, Professor. I have a question about, I was reading recently the budget of Australia, the 2001 budget, and there's about $1 billion earmarked for aid to East Timor, which I thought was a very positive thing going on in the First World. Now, I'm not very knowledgeable of what else Australia is doing abroad, but I was wondering if you had any other observations about, I guess, progress in that vein in the First World.
I was in Australia a couple of years, 3 or 4 years ago. I was invited by the East Timor Refugees Association, mainly to give talks denouncing the government of Australia, which I did as loudly and clearly as I could. It's published if you want to read it. There's a book. But in Australia, it's easier than here. It's a much more open society. So, you know, it's possible to give a talk at the National Press Club in Canberra, which is broadcast over national television a couple of times, in which you stand up and denounce the government of Australia as a gang of criminals, you know, and that kind of, or, you know, give talks in the town halls in Sydney and Melbourne, overflowing audiences, you know, with Timorese refugees talking and doing the same thing. And there was a reason for that. Australia had a horrible record in connection with East Timor. Australia was the only Western, remember where it is, East Timor is right off Australia, right? Australia was the only country that gave de jure recognition to the Indonesian conquest. Part of the reason was that there was oil in the gap between East Timor and Australia. The Timor Gap has a lot of oil. And the population in Australia was infuriated about this. And one of the results was that a ton of stuff was getting leaked from secret documents. I mean, I know people in the Foreign Service who I literally had to protect. They were leaking documents, and the Australian government came after me and, you know, demanded I give back the documents. I had to pretend I never heard of them, things like that. And there were all kind of stuff going on. But anyway, we know an awful lot about Australia because everything was getting leaked because the population was infuriated. There's a reason for that too, which I'll get to. But the record was vicious. And part of the leaking was that in the build-up to the Indonesian invasion, which of course Australia knew about, meaning the U.S. knew about it, the Australian ambassador said that Australia would do better making a deal with Indonesia for the oil of the Timor Gap than with an independent East Timor. So therefore they ought to support the invasion and then the massacre and the genocide and everything else. So that was going on right through that time. Well, up till 1998, I mean, at that point it just burst the floodgates. What was going on in East Timor in 1998 and 1999 was very hard to conceal in Australia. For one thing, because Australian intelligence has the place totally covered, and U.S. intelligence even more so. One of the big observation centers for the NSA is in Pine Bluffs, Australia, you know, for the whole region. They know they know if anybody's buying a Coke in East Timor, they know about it. And what was going on at that time was that the Clinton administration was illegally, in violation of congressional directives, arming and training Indonesian military officers, including Kopassus, which is the Special Forces Commandos. They're modeled on the Green Berets. Have a long record of horrendous atrocities. They were being trained in late 1998. They were sent into East Timor. They were going to carry out an operation called Operation Clean Sweep, which is going to intimidate the population enough so that they're going to vote for incorporation in Indonesia. This started in early '99. Every newsroom in the United States knew about it. They had to, you know. All you had to do was read the international wire services, which they do. It was all over the Australian press. U.S. intelligence certainly knew about it. It's just impossible not to. And the population in Australia knew about it. It was all over the press. Big atrocities going on, you know, Australians going up and back. There was an explosion in Australia. The Australian government had to reverse course. It had to withdraw the recognition. It started heavy pressure on the United States to stop supporting the atrocities. It didn't work. The United States, Clinton kept supporting them right through the end. Finally, in mid-September, it got to the point where there was going to be an international blow-up over it, and the Clinton administration shifted and told the Indonesians to get out. 24 hours later, they got out. It tells you, just tells you what the latent power was for 25 years. But it's another one of those things you're not supposed to notice. Timor. It was Portuguese, half Portuguese, half Dutch. Australia invaded it, okay, to try to prevent an ultimate Japanese invasion. Now, if Australia hadn't invaded it, the Japanese would have probably left it alone. They left the other Portuguese colonies alone. But once Australia invaded, the Japanese counter-invaded. And they just carried out a slaughter. Now, the Australians were very quickly driven out, but they left a couple hundred commandos there. And the commandos were supposed to try to disrupt the Japanese forces enough so that they wouldn't invade northern Australia, Darwin. And they succeeded. There was a lot of disruption. The reason they succeeded is they were protected by the Timorese. The Timorese lost about 60,000 people, protecting a couple 100,000 Australians. And that saved Australia from being invaded by Japan. Well, that's not in the history books, but it's in everybody's memory. It's the kind of memory that seeps into the popular culture, and it led to enormous real fury about the Australian government policies. So the place was really seething over this. And finally, Australia did turn around. And that's the background for what you read.
You've talked about threats from military systems and from social and economic systems, but I wonder if you could address specifically ecological threats to the future of the species which will grow out of those social and economic systems.
The ecological, the only reason I didn't talk about the ecological threats is because they're so obvious. I mean, if you have a really functioning market system, if such a monstrosity were permitted to survive, which of course it never is, a market system is one in which your dollar is your vote, right? You got as many votes as you have dollars. And the system, if it's functioning properly, is supposed to respond to your votes. Well, if you have 0 votes, $0, 0 votes. Unborn generations have $0, okay? So therefore, what happens to them is of 0 significance in a market system, 0. Okay, well, what's done today, they got to live with, right? I mean, if we destroy resources or something, well, they're going to have to live with it. But they don't have anything to say about it in a properly functioning market system. Okay, so therefore, to the limited extent that market systems are allowed to function, they're just guaranteed to self-destruct. It's kind of like a guarantee. I mean, maybe if it was a small enough system, it could survive for a while, but not for very long. And that's why if you take a look at modern history, at least in rich and developed countries that were more or less organized and functioning, they never allowed market systems to function. In Britain, there was an experiment with laissez-faire around the 1860s and 1870s. It was called off very quickly by the business world because they saw it's going to wipe out communities and the environment. So they called it off and they instituted a kind of social democratic system. I mean, there's a classic book about this, which, it's so good, it's admired by everybody all across the political spectrum. It's kind of like a real classic. That's Karl Polanyi's book, The Great Transformation. It was written about 50 years ago and been reprinted a couple of times. It's pretty much about the 19th century, the background for it, and then the experiment with laissez-faire, and then the calling off of the experiment. In fact, the only countries that ever followed market systems were the ones that had it rammed down their throat by force. So like India followed a market system, but that's because Britain conquered it, and forced it to follow a market system, and it destroyed the country. Actually, this is, all this business with China right now. Nobody can figure out why China is so angry. Well, take a look at Chinese history, you understand exactly why they're angry. As late as remember that Europe was a backwater. I mean, the main commercial and industrial centers of the world were Asia. India and China in particular were major commercial and industrial centers in the 18th century. England couldn't compete with them. England succeeded in crushing India by highly protectionist programs of its own, like very high tariffs to keep out Indian goods, and imposing free market principles on India, which of course wiped it out. They just did it by force. So, you know, for 2 centuries, India didn't develop, probably declined. You know. It didn't begin developing again until after independence. But they hadn't conquered China. And as late as around 1860, the British were still unable to compete with the Chinese. You read the reports of, you know, British attaches in Hong Kong, which they had conquered. They're concerned because you can't sell anything to China because what they make is better. Like, they don't want Lancashire textiles because they make better textiles. And other things they just don't care about. But Britain did want things from China, like it wanted tea. You know, they were stealing Chinese tea plants to plant them in India, which were extremely important. They were part of the way of pacifying the British working class, tea and sugar. That's why the Caribbean was so important. Soft drugs were required during the Industrial Revolution to sort of keep people down. And tea was a big part of it, and silk and various other things. And they couldn't break into the China market because they just, you know, just couldn't do it. Well, there was one way they could do it: narco-trafficking. They could do it with narco-trafficking. This started a century earlier. In fact, Adam Smith was already condemning the British in India for forcing the peasants to produce opium, poppies, instead of crops. He said the British are turning dearth into famine in India, the big famine in Bengal, which Smith correctly blamed on the British imperial powers, which were trying to get opium. They were trying to get it into China. Well, the Chinese blocked it. They were an organized society. Britain did fight a war in 1840, the first opium war, to try to break it down, and it didn't quite work. In 1860, around 1860, came the Second Opium War. And Britain did succeed, not just Britain, you know, the whole of the United States was involved, and everybody. It was mainly Britain. They were the big guys in those days. They did succeed in breaking open the Chinese market and selling them the one thing they could sell them, namely opium. Okay, a large part of the conquest of India was for the same purpose. They wanted to conquer India so they could get a monopoly of opium production. Opium was produced in Turkey and all sorts of places, but they wanted a monopoly. And a good part of the conquest of India around that time, in the 50s and the 60s, was to gain a monopoly of the opium traffic, which they could then force into China, you know. And of course, you know, you can sell opium. And that was a good that the Chinese were essentially compelled to accept. And it ended up with a kind of a market system, except that the British had a near monopoly on the marketing. And it ended up destroying China. You know, then the other imperial countries came in and took their pieces and so on and so forth. I mean, China didn't forget this. We may want to forget it, but they didn't. And it was no small thing. The British Empire depended very heavily on narco-trafficking. The profits from drugs, first of all, they funded the British Navy. They covered all the costs of the British Navy, which was the basis for the empire. They funded all the costs of the administration of India, you know, which is a big thing. And they also financed the purchase of cotton from the United States, which was, cotton is kind of like oil in those days. You know, it's the main commodity in world trade. And they had to get it from the United States, which was first produced by slaves, later by so-called semi-slaves. And they, this financed it. It was the core of the British imperial system. This is during the so-called free trade period. Okay, so this huge narco-trafficking enterprise with China at the center of it was what kept the whole imperial system going for Britain. And that was the global system. You know, everybody else had empires, but small ones by comparison. These are no small things. So they ended up having a market and getting destroyed. Okay. Meanwhile, every industrial country, including the United States, violated market principles radically. I mean, and still does to this day. You know. The third world is what was called an ocean of liberalism by economic historians. And it's good reason, part of the reason why it became the third world. And you can see the same processes at work right now, to the limited extent that these systems are allowed to function. But getting back to the ecological thing where we started, I mean, there it's just transparent. I mean, if a market system really functions, it's going to wipe out the environment. Therefore, any technique of saving the environment, caring about the environment, has got to be market interference, regulations or something. And you can critify it in any way you like. You can say you're internalizing the costs or play some other game. But the fact of the matter is it's regulation. It's a communal decision, to do something about making sure that our children can live. It's essentially the core of the environmental movement. If you don't have that, yeah, they're not going to live. There are differences, I don't think they're overwhelming, between the Clinton and the Bush business communities. And yeah, the Bush guys are less concerned about whether anybody lives in the next generation. And you can see that in, decision after decision. So like, what's her name? Christine Todd Whitman gets up on television and says that she's read the National Academy of Sciences report of a 10-year study on arsenic and in water, and she decided it isn't good science. Okay. I mean, it isn't good science because the chemical companies don't like it. And people are supposed to watch her on television say that and not laugh, yeah, okay, so there'll be more arsenic in the water, so, kids will die. But that's somewhere down the road, who cares? Meanwhile, the chemical companies make profits tomorrow. And the same is true on decision after decision. So sure, the relation between environments and markets is very clear. And the same thing is true of the Kyoto Protocol. I mean, the Kyoto Protocol is not much, but it's something. And it's true, it would probably cut down it's not even obvious, but it might cut down short-term profits. I mean, if it was instituted, there'd be a way of making profit on it, pollution control devices and so on. But in the short term, it's probably not what every CEO would like. So therefore, the Bush administration is just dismantling it. And in this case, they're really infuriating the whole world. I mean, even Europe is going berserk. Yeah. Last.
You've always been critical of the system of capitalism, yet you provide a few solutions. What do we replace capitalism with? What's your solution, and what do you have to say to the people of Eastern Europe when they look at capitalism as the savior?
As sacred.
Yeah.
They've had it throughout their whole history. There's never a period when they didn't have it. They had one form of, I gave a long story about that. They're under the illusion that what they had was socialism because they choose to believe propaganda. One of the interesting things about the Eastern Europe system is that it really destroyed people's minds. I mean, they actually believed the propaganda that was coming from the West. Throughout the whole Cold War, the Russians, especially the Russian intellectuals, were very pro-American. They loved the United States. If they could be like the United States, we used to have these visits from Russian scientists in the 60s and the 70s, peppered with KGB agents. It was a joke, They loved the United States. I mean, I can tell you a personal story. I remember going to Vietnam War meetings. There were international peace conferences on Vietnam in Sweden and Denmark and places like that. They were usually run by the local Communist Party, because those are the guys who had the resources, and besides they wanted to control it. You know how it works. So they set it up and had the meetings and tried to run it. And these meetings were comical. If anybody had any talent, they could have written a comic novel about it. I mean, the meetings were a combination of old-time Communist Party hacks who were running the thing and trying to control it behind the works, all of whom loved Nixon and loved the United States and wanted the United States to smash and destroy Vietnam. Because for one thing, because they're all racists and these are yellow bastards. And then on the other hand, you had these Quaker ladies from the United States trying to pass statements condemning the Vietnam War. And in the background, in the back rooms, they're kind of like arguing how you formulate the thing. It went on all the time. Yeah, so Eastern Europe was under the illusion that the West is something like what you see on Dallas. Okay. Well, now they're learning what the West is like. They're living it, and it's a total disaster, of course, for the poor. They know it. But they still have the illusion in their heads. And don't forget, the rich people are benefiting. So rich, educated people in Eastern Europe are benefiting from the return to the third world. You go to the poorest third world country there is, Central Africa. There's a class of wealthy, educated people who, read all the latest journals from Paris and talk all kind of postmodern nonsense and live in fancy apartment houses and are very wealthy than any of us are. And they just don't look at what's happening out the window. Yeah, that's what Eastern Europe's becoming like. So for them, they probably see just what Anthony Lewis sees. The greatest economic boom in the history of the world. And, they're participating in it. They're well off, driving, I think there are more Mercedes sold per capita in Moscow than any other city in the world. Yeah, it's fine. That's kind of capitalism. On the other hand, what the alternative is, well, it's very old-fashioned. I mean, what working people and ordinary people have been struggling for forever. Workers' control of production. Workers owning their own factories, communities controlling what goes on inside them, voluntary associations, federal arrangements. It's the whole history of popular struggle for centuries. Yeah, it's an alternative. I mean, tyranny, controlled by tyrannical institutions is not the only possible way human society can be run. I mean, it's a good way for the guys on top of the tyrannical institutions, but no reason why anyone else should accept it. There's no shortage of alternatives.